The Russian army is exhausted. In 3 years of brutal war, the once feared military machine has literally melted away. The Kremlin is in a panic, unable to find soldiers. The losses are so catastrophic that the government is seeking foreign fighters from Africa and Asia. But this is insufficient. The Kremlin's real plan is to secretly mobilize 2 million reserve soldiers to the front. And now, Putin's final desperate move has come. Putin has banned all men of military age from leaving the country. The Kremlin regime has closed all borders to imprison 2 million young men and potentially millions more. This is a digital Iron Curtain. But the ultimate crisis has erupted. 2 million young Russians are rebelling and refusing to go to war. The war has come to Russia's doorstep, and the doors are now locked. There are two fundamental and interrelated reasons behind the panic driving this total lockdown decision. The first is a trauma from the past, namely the fiasco of 2022. The second is today's bitter reality, the ultimate exhaustion of the army and the fire of rebellion flaring up among the people in response. Looking at the historical cause of the panic, what happened in September 2022, when Putin declared a partial mobilization, appears as a nightmare etched in the Kremlin's memory. As documented in analysts' detailed reports, at least 260,000 trained men, instead of heeding the administration's patriotic call, left the country, effectively humiliating the Kremlin on the international stage. This mass exodus was both a loss of valuable human resources and the first major proof of Putin's collapse, shattering his "the people have united with the army" propaganda. For the Kremlin, this is a humiliation it never wants to experience again. However, today's crisis is much deeper and more existential than that of 2022. 3 years of attrition warfare have literally exhausted the Russian army. Western intelligence estimates and daily reports from the Ukrainian General Staff indicate that Russian losses, including dead and wounded, have exceeded 1 million. The professional army has almost evaporated. Storm Z units, made up of convicts, have been ground down at the front. Hundreds of thousands of mobilized mobics were sent to the front with inadequate training and equipment and were largely wiped out. The army's manpower logistics are completely bankrupt. The clearest evidence of this bankruptcy is revealed in a published analysis report. According to the report, unable to find soldiers among its own citizens, the Kremlin is desperately trying to recruit foreign fighters from Cuba, Nepal, Syria, and African countries. However, this falls far short of filling the massive void on the front lines. That is why the Kremlin resorted to that terrible last resort, a secret mobilization targeting 2 million reservists. A statement by Kirilo Budanov, head of Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, dated October 19, 2025, confirms that new laws and preparations have begun that open the door to this secret partial mobilization. The 2 million reserve soldiers targeted represent a massive group of people who have previously served in the military but are currently living civilian lives. However, this massive mobilization plan hit an unexpected and devastating wall for the Kremlin, a popular uprising. Al Jazeera's April 16, 2025 report, titled "Russia's Biggest Military Call-Up Creates Fear Among Young Men," reflects the current situation and reveals the extent of this fear and rejection. The new generation of Russian youth, who have witnessed the horrors of 3 years of war and learned the realities of the front lines through social media, do not believe Putin's patriotism lies. Young people aged 18 to 30 are trying every means possible to avoid going to war. They are hiding, forging documents, and most importantly, fleeing the country if they get the chance. When the Kremlin called up 2 million reservists, it knew that a large portion of these young people would rush to the borders, just as they did in 2022. This is where the Iron Trap came into play. The technical infrastructure of this system was flawless. Electronic draft notices sent via Gosuslugi were instantly integrated with the FSB's border control database. This was the technical lock on the secret mobilization. The goal is to catch young people, potentially millions more, before they can escape and send them to the front lines. This is not a show of force. It is the last gasp of a regime afraid of its own exhausted army and the young people who are speaking out against it. Today, The Kremlin's decision to potentially imprison millions of men in their own country is not only a military necessity, but also the ultimate betrayal of the tacit, social contract Vladimir Putin has had with the Russian people since he came to power in 2000. To understand the roots of this betrayal, we must examine these three critical cases that show how the contract was established and how it was dismantled piece by piece. The foundation of Putin's 20-year rule was based not on military power, but on this tacit agreement. But this contract was built on the chaos and poverty of the 1990s. The agreement was simple. You don't interfere in politics, you don't protest, you don't question how elections are conducted, you don't challenge my power. In return, I promise you economic stability, predictability, rising wages, and most importantly, security, unlike the shame of the 1990s. He emphasizes that this contract depoliticized Russian society, meaning that the people adopted the mindset of, as long as the state doesn't touch me, I won't touch the state. This was the cornerstone of Putin's fortress of stability myth, and for years, aided by oil prices, it largely worked. When the war began on February 24, 2022, this contract took its first blow, but it had not yet collapsed. The Kremlin tried to avoid disrupting the lives of the middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg by marketing the war as a special military operation, and sending mostly ethnic minorities or contract soldiers to the front. However, the partial mobilization in September 2022 shattered this illusion. For the first time, the state knocked directly on the door of that depoliticized middle class and violated the security and stability part of the contract that fell to it. The mass exodus of more than 260,000 documented men was not just a panic move, but also the first major mass vote of no confidence in the social contract. The people did not support the regime in the name of patriotism. The moment the regime failed to keep its word, the people broke the agreement and fled. This was a humiliation for the administration. The Kremlin had learned the hard way that its people did not want war. For the millions who could not escape or chose to stay, resistance turned into a mass, passive resistance rather than active protest. This perfectly documents the internal collapse. Reports reveal that the Russian people did not believe the patriotism lie and tried every means possible to avoid going to war. This resistance manifested itself in the form of obtaining fake medical reports, bribing officials to be labeled unfit for military service, hiding in forest huts, or constantly changing jobs and addresses to avoid capture. We can also see how the mobilization has fragmented Russia's demographic structure, depleted its skilled workforce, and created deep mistrust within society. The people are in a state of internal exile from the state. The reality was not a patriotic army, but a hiding army, because it is no different within this army. According to a report dated October 18, 2025, published by the Ukrainian Main Intelligence Directorate, or GUR, and the OSINT project Frontelligence Insight, the desertion of more than 25,000 soldiers from a single military region of the Russian army in just 9 months, and the expectation that the total number of deserters will reach 70,000 by the end of the year, bears a dangerous resemblance to the collapse of the Tsarist Russian army in 1917. This wave of desertions now includes not only recruits, but also experienced soldiers fleeing directly from the front lines and military hospitals. And those deserting with their weapons are creating a massive internal security crisis within Russia. The Kremlin's response to this rebellion reveals its helplessness. Systematic extrajudicial executions of soldiers for insubordination are being carried out at the front. However, this situation is backfiring, making desertion a more rational option for survival. This new iron trap maneuver is the final and most deadly link in this chain of betrayal. In 2022, the state broke the contract's promise of security. Today, by closing escape routes and forcibly pushing reserves to the front, it is eliminating the last crumb of the contract, namely the promise that the state will not touch you. The Kremlin no longer tells its people, "Don't get involved in politics, take your stability." It tells its people, "You will obey, you will not escape, and you will die to fill the ranks of my exhausted army." This is not a contract, This is an act of hostage-taking. That tacit agreement has been torn up at the digital border gate that has closed in the faces of millions of Russian men. The ripple effect triggered by this Iron Curtain will not only create social panic, it will strike at the very foundation of the Russian war economy and create total economic paralysis. For this move has shattered the Kremlin's greatest dilemma, the deadly balance between soldiers for the front and workers for the economy. The first wave of mobilization flight in 2022 was a brain drain. The loss of more than 260,000 educated people, mostly IT specialists, engineers, and financiers, was a devastating blow to the Russian economy. Tech companies could no longer find qualified personnel. The banking system faltered, and projects to create alternatives to Western technologies collapsed before they even began. This was the loss of part of the economy's brain, and as previously noted, it constituted one of the fundamental causes of the Russian economy's overheating and skilled labor shortage. However, the new catastrophe we are experiencing today is not a brain drain. It is something much more deadly. It is a brain lockdown. The difference is strategically vital. The IT specialist who fled in 2022 could continue to work, even from Yerevan, and contribute indirectly to the Russian economy, even if not through taxes. Now, what will that engineer, that doctor, that skilled factory worker, or that truck driver do, whose escape route is locked and who is included, or fears being included in the target reserve soldier group? They have two options: either get caught and sent to the front to be destroyed, or resort to passive resistance, i.e., go into hiding. Either option means that person and millions of others like them will cease to be a productive unit for the Russian economy. This will create a massive economic shockwave, especially with the lockdown of the targeted reserve soldiers. In this situation, three scenarios emerge. In the first scenario, hundreds of thousands of engineers and IT specialists, fearing being sent to the front lines, delete their records from the Gosuslugi system, stop going to work, and become unregistered. The Ural Vagonzavod factory, which produces tanks, the Almaz Ante facility, which produces missiles, or technology companies that develop drone software, would lose their most critical and irreplaceable brainpower. Production lines would halt. In the second scenario, the fear of mobilization spreads among truck drivers, train engineers, and construction workers. These people leave their blue-collar jobs, which are the easiest to be drafted into the army. As a result, the overheated economy highlighted in the reports experiences a logistical paralysis. There are no drivers left to transport raw materials to factories or ammunition to the front lines. In the third and final scenario, as doctors, teachers, and other civilian professionals go into hiding, the civilian infrastructure collapses. More importantly, these millions of missing men no longer pay taxes because they are no longer officially employed. Consequently, domestic taxes, the most crucial revenue stream the Kremlin needs to finance the war, evaporate. Putin, aiming to fill his depleted army with 2 million reserves, has ripped those young men and millions of other productive men who fear them out of the economy. This is a move that will lead to what is termed overheating, a total economic cooling, and bring the economy to a standstill. The Russian economy is now being strangled not only by Western sanctions, but by the Kremlin's own panic. However, the ripple effect is not just economic. There is now no escape from Russia, and the Kremlin has left millions of young people, and potentially more, with two choices: die on the front lines or resist the regime. In 2022, escape was an option. Now, it is only a matter of time before that fear and denial turn into rebellion. The anatomy of this crisis is the purest, most ruthless example of the strategy of destruction. With this iron trap move, Putin has not only locked the borders, he has shattered the most fundamental political and military doctrine upon which his regime is built, the patriotic army strategy, before the eyes of millions of citizens. Since 2022, the Kremlin's official propaganda has been based on the lie that this war is not against Ukraine, but the Second Great Patriotic War against Western aggression. According to this propaganda, the Russian people, as in 1941, had united for the motherland and formed volunteer queues to join the army. The patriotic army myth was the cornerstone of the regime's legitimacy on the home front. But this strategy died with that first border-crossing integration. For if a regime claims that it's patriotic, people are eager to join that sacred war, why must it lock all borders to prevent those people from fleeing the motherland? Why must it try to secretly mobilize 2 million reservists, summoning them like thieves in the night? This is not an army, but a legion of slaves. An army stands together with a shared purpose, ideology, or sense of patriotism. Putin's army has now lost these bonds. If an army can gather millions of people by forcibly imprisoning its soldiers, manage them on the front lines with drunken commanders, and prevent them from escaping by putting digital shackles on them, this is no longer a modern military force, but a community of reluctant slaves, forced to fight for their masters, like in the final days of ancient Rome. The final drop in this strategic chess game is the collapse of the regime's declared trust in its own people. In 2022, the people's trust in the regime had been shaken. Today, the regime has openly told 2 million young people, and thus the entire society, "I don't trust you. I see you not as a citizen, but as a disposable resource I need to fill my depleted army, a hostage, and to prevent you from escaping, I am locking you in your own home." The bigger picture is the establishment of the social explosion equation. Putin's iron trap move has turned not only 2 million young people, but the entire Russian society into a powder keg. This has created the perfect storm for a social tsunami and a total mutiny. To understand this new equation, we must go back to the fall of 2022. When Putin declared partial mobilization, the home front had reached breaking point. Violent protests erupted, especially in regions with large ethnic minority populations. In Dagestan, hundreds of women and men blocked roads chanting, "This is not our war," attempted to storm conscription centers, and clashed with police. The regime was shaken, but it did not collapse. Because in 2022, people, especially angry young men who did not want to fight, had an escape route. Instead of fighting for the Kremlin, they fled to Georgia, Kazakhstan, or Armenia. This mass exodus was an embarrassing brain drain for the regime, but it also served as a safety valve for the Kremlin. The gas was let out of the most angry, most oppositional, most dynamic segment of society. Those who remained in the country were either more passive or more fearful. Now, looking at today's new equation, the doors are locked and the escape route for millions of men is gone. Now, there is nowhere for that young man from Dagestan, that IT specialist from Moscow, or that worker from Siberia, who are facing a new wave of mobilization, to go. Millions of men are literally trapped. This decision creates a mass of people who have nothing left to lose, a mass that can be counted in the millions. This mass now has two options: either passively wait to be caught and accept death as cannon fodder in the ranks of an exhausted army on the Ukrainian front, or fight. But not against Ukraine, against their own regime that is sending them to their deaths. This situation represents the crossing of that psychological threshold. When a state begins to view its own citizens as the greatest internal threat, that state begins to fall under the definition of a failed state. Putin's iron trap is an admission of the regime's deadly fear of its own people. As experts have pointed out, Putin is destroying the very foundation of the state, its connection to society, in the name of protecting the state. This is the inevitable outcome of the collapse of the internal front. The fuse has been lit. Ultimately, Putin has brought Russia to the brink of destruction in order to defeat Ukraine and has exhausted his army. And now, in order to gather the 2 million reserves needed to fill the front lines, he has turned the entire country into a giant open-air prison, facing the rebellion of his own people. The 20-year social contract has been destroyed along with that last line of code integrated into the FSB's border database. War has come to Russia's doorstep, and the doors are now locked. Putin has only raised the walls of his own prison. The real question is who that cornered crowd will bring those walls crashing down on. So, what are your thoughts on this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.